Hello, and welcome to today's Iowa Geriatric Education Center presentation entitled Healthy Aging, a Strategy for Cognitive Health. My name is Paul Mulhausen. I am a geriatrician and internal medicine specialist, and I have the title of Chief Medical Officer for a population health management firm headquartered here in Iowa called Telegen. I did want to start out by disclosing that I have no conflict of interest in reference to the topic we'll be discussing today, which is a lifespan approach to healthy aging in the spirit of optimizing cognitive health and minimizing the risk for dementia. You've been, those of you who have been participating in this year's series know that the primary topic has been dementia. In recent years, I've gotten very interested in the topic of healthy aging and lifestyle medicine to promote health and aging. And I've been intrigued by its potential impact at minimizing the risk for dementia and optimizing cognitive health across the lifespan. So as we thought through potential topics of interest, I thought you'd be very interested in some of the research around this topic and tips that you could use to help your patients. I do have a series of objectives for this particular presentation, and so I want you to be able to describe the relationship between known health behaviors and the risk of dementia over the course of life. I want you to be able to summarize the research evidence that strongly suggests people can reduce their risk of dementia with key lifestyle changes. I want you to be able to describe the current thinking around the mechanisms by which lifestyle affects brain health and memory. And in all honesty, it's in that particular objective I probably am least informed. And then I want you to be able to share some tips with others that they can use to reduce their risk of cognitive decline. Just an interesting story. I had dinner on Tuesday. I had dinner 2 nights ago with a colleague internist, and we were talking about dementia, and I was talking about dementia prevention. And my colleague said, well, there is no way to prevent dementia. And I'm here to help break down that myth and help you understand ways that healthy living and healthy lifestyles can optimize brain health and reduce the overall risk of dementia. So dementia is a problem that is a growing problem worldwide. And of course, it's not unique to our own communities and our own country. It's an international issue. And this slide nicely illustrates how in both high-income countries and in low and middle income countries, the number of people with dementia is predicted to rise quite rapidly. And you can see that as a worldwide problem, it is predicted to rise much more rapidly with populations in low and middle income countries as their populations experience the kind of demographic changes that the high-income countries have experienced and characterized by aging aging of their populations. So when we talk about prevention, we're not only talking about what we can do in our own lifestyle around in high-income countries, but the potential impact of these preventive measures, these lifestyle changes, these risk factor mitigation strategies across the globe in low and middle income countries as well. So you are all probably familiar with this if you've been participating in the webinar series that the Iowa GEC has been sponsoring. And you probably recognize that one of the primary risks of dementia is getting older. And so both the lifetime risk increases with age and the prevalence of dementia increases with age. And one of the well-recognized opportunities is in the postponement of the onset of dementia. If dementia can be delayed by a year or two, the overall social impact of dementia declines purely by virtue of people not living long enough to actually experience the changes related to dementia. In addition, I think it's useful to recognize that this is a very common problem now, certainly in America, and 44% of the population has a family member or a friend living with dementia. And most people, when you ask them, worry a little bit about their risk of developing dementia. And if you ask people over the age of 55, dementia actually ends up being the most feared condition, with 39% of people reporting they were most afraid of dementia, and 30% reporting that they were most afraid of cancer. So when you consider the personal impact of dementia on our lives and on the lives of our loved ones and family members, this is a big deal. And actually thinking through, what can I do as a person who wants to live to be a ripe old age? What can I do to actually minimize my own personal risk? You know that dementia, and we just talked about that, is a function of longer lifespans. But this particular quotation, I think, is a good notion. I don't know. I can't think of the right word. This particular phrasing highlights the global impact here. So dementia is the greatest global challenge for health and social care in the 21st century. It occurs mainly in people older than 65. So increases in numbers and costs are driven worldwide by increased longevity, resulting from the welcome reduction in people dying prematurely. Fewer people are dying prematurely, more of us are living into our old age. And the growing challenges posed by dementia are a function of longer lifespans. And this always makes me think about U.B. Blake, the jazz pianist, who said, if I'd known I was going to live this long, I'd have taken better care of myself. And ultimately, that is my message here today. Our people are living longer. We are living longer. We should anticipate that we would live longer. Given the concerns that we have about cognitive decline in our old age and the potential to develop dementia, we should be thinking through a lifespan approach to mitigating the risk. Now, we're going to go back to a couple of little basics here for a broad audience. And just remind people that dementia and Alzheimer's disease are two distinct issues. So dementia is the loss of cognitive function. Remember, it's memory and a couple other domains of cognitive function. And Alzheimer's disease is the primary diagnosis in most cases. But dementia itself is not necessarily Alzheimer's disease. And there are multiple reasons for a person to develop dementia. And again, I think it's important when you're thinking through causality of the risk factors we're going to discuss, and you would think through how can this be. It's important to realize that the brain changes seen in Alzheimer's disease are not the same as dementia. and can occur in people without dementia, which is a very interesting phenomenon. And I think my view at this particular point is preventing dementia may or may not be preventing Alzheimer's disease. There's some research that says maybe it's postponing Alzheimer's disease. And there's some research that says, well, maybe it's doing things in the brain like improving circulation, improving vascular health, that when superimposed on the pathologic changes that characterize Alzheimer's disease tip us over into the experience of dementia. So this whole issue of, we're talking today primarily about optimizing cognition and preventing dementia, and I'm not really framing it completely as a preventing Alzheimer's disease. And from my point of view, that ends up being an important point to make, an important distinction. So you can actually, so there's a physician social scientist here at the University of Iowa, Bob Wallace, who's spent a lifetime studying the epidemiology of chronic diseases. And I distinctly remember him talking to me about the evolving understanding we had about risk factors for dementia. And this would have been maybe 10 years ago. And he said, at that time, he said, we're starting to recognize that there are risk factors for dementia, and it's almost like we're starting to see the same kinds of patterns that we saw for heart disease. So we started to recognize that there were risk factors for heart disease many, many years ago, and we started to do the work to see what happens if you actually reduce those risks and mitigate those risks. And so I think it's useful to characterize what we know about risk factors for developing dementia. And here I've boxed the risk factors that have been associated with dementia into non-modifiable, things that to our knowledge right now we can't change. Modifiable, which I think you can see here has the most bullet points. That could just be how I constructed the slide, but there are a lot of bullet points there, right? And then emerging. Associations with dementia or risk factors for dementia found in epidemiologic studies that may not be quite ready for full acceptance as risk factors, but certainly seem to be emerging. And head injuries I find especially interesting here because I've characterized it as emerging, but I've also thought through the issues around CTE and sports and recurrent head injuries. And when we talk about ways to mitigate risk, we'll still talk about head injury prevention. But you can see that your age, you want to get old, at least I do. I'm quite looking forward to that. Your sex or gender, the genetics, we know that there are specific Alzheimer's related illnesses that are rooted in single genetic changes. And we know that ApoE4 is a risk modifier for Alzheimer's disease. And there, at our present level of technology, we're not really able to alter those or modify those risks. When we look at modifiable, there are really a series of very interesting and kind of basic risk factors that you could almost envision as being rooted in vascular pathology that could affect the brain and potentially worsen or cause dementia. And then there are the emerging risk factors that you can see here, and we'll talk a little bit about those, but most of our attention will be focused on the modifiable risk factors. And I promised to spend some time talking about the mechanisms. I Again, as I said, this is probably the area I am least informed in, so I don't want to overstate my expertise and spend too much time on this. So primarily I've shared with you this particular Venn diagram that illustrates how there are mechanisms that are hypothesized around all of these particular risk factors that include increasing brain cognitive reserve, that include reducing brain inflammation, and that include reducing brain damage, either from vascular injury, neurotoxic stresses, or oxidative stress. So you can clearly envision a circumstance where a person who has a rich social network and is engaged with a lot of people and interpersonal relationships could potentially be developing their brain in a way or preserving their brain in a way that increases their cognitive reserve. And if they experience say a neurovascular insult, they may tolerate it better. So I think that's a single risk factor example of how it could potentially have a biologic effect through one of these mechanisms. And so this slide is primarily there to help you get a sense for how some of these risk factors are postulated to improve cognition and brain health. And you may ask yourself, okay, you find these risk factors. That's kind of interesting. But is there any other evidence that the risk for dementia is actually modifiable? And actually there is. We know from intergenerational studies, and we know from cross geography or cross nation studies that there are changing rates of dementia incidence. And here in the United States, there has actually been a overall declining incidence of dementia despite the rising prevalence. So if you adjust the incidence for the aging of the population, you still end up with a lot of people with dementia and a growing prevalence. But the rate at which people are developing dementia has actually been declining. And you can speculate on why. So you probably remember from our earlier slide that education is a risk factor. We'll talk about that in more detail, but improvements in education have taken place across a broad population of people in the United States. And many people speculate that that's part of it. Smoking has declined dramatically. Smoking is a major risk factor for dementia, and smoking has declined. And then there are reduced other exposures through environmental protection issues. So there's good evidence that age-specific rates of new dementia have been declining, and there seem to be associated risk factor rate changes that can be explanations for why this is happening. So again, changing rates would suggest to us that something is different in the environment or in our lifestyle that is changing the rate at which we experience dementia. Now, interestingly, dementia incidence, age-specific, is rising in China. And there are a lot of reasons that people speculate that that could be happening. So even though here in the United States, there's evidence for this declining age-specific rate, in other countries that are experiencing greater exposure to some of these risk factors, their rates have been going up. And again, the point of that is that it gets your brain thinking, wait a minute, maybe there is stuff we can be doing. And the other interesting part about it is you think, well, wow, this is cool. We're doing the right thing. But I'd like to remind everybody that some of the risk factors include diabetes and high body mass index, and inactivity, physical inactivity. And at this particular juncture, we're expecting in the next decade or so to experience a 40% increase of Americans with type 2 diabetes. And so we know that diabetes and hypertension increase the risk of both Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia. We know that the more physical illnesses that a person experiences, the more likely they are to get dementia. And we know that midlife rates of obesity and associated health problems are rising right now, and they are currently projected to lead to a 19% increase in dementia in China and a 9% increase in the USA if the numbers don't change. So there are continued opportunities to improve a lifespan approach to risk reduction and prevention to minimize the risk of developing dementia in late life. So the other thing that I thought really important to highlight is, the underlying science behind all of this. And many of you, if not most of you, are already familiar with evidence-based medicine principles and concepts, and you recognize that there are varying degrees of quality in the evidence. And I need to clarify here that most of our understanding around these risk factors and the concepts that I'm going to share with you around what to do about it are really rooted in studies of people's experience and exposures. These are epidemiologic studies. They're often cohort, they're forward-looking, but they are almost routinely not testing hypotheses through a experimental design. And there is persistent confusion about causation versus association in some of the factors. And I'm going to talk about one shortly to just highlight that particular confusion to some extent. And then experiments to help people modify or change the risk have not always demonstrated meaningful impact. So when you take these concepts, these risks, and you ask people to change their lifestyle in the spirit of, let's see what happens if we can improve cognition or minimize dementia, we're really at the very earliest stages of understanding how effective that is. And so, and I'd have to say at this particular juncture with very complicated experimental clinical trials, the evidence appears mixed, but in general looks optimistic for the concepts that I'm going to suggest that we actually promote to our patients. So hearing loss. So hearing loss is, in my mind, a nice example of some confusion around, is the hearing loss associated with dementia? Is it a causative risk factor? How do you tease all that out? And is it reasonable for us to expect that helping people mitigate their hearing loss, say with hearing aids and hearing amplification, might in fact improve or lower the risk of later dementia? So I thought this is a nice example of where it gets a little confusing about association versus cause and effect. Now, the good news out of all this, it's bad news, but the interesting part of this is that studies that have looked at hearing loss as a risk factor have been designed in a way that the hearing loss was identified before the onset of dementia. And that pattern seems to be consistent. So although out of 13 studies, 2 did not demonstrate any increased risk of cognitive decline, 11 of those 13 studies show that even mild levels of hearing loss increase the long-term risk of cognitive decline. you could ask yourself, well, how does hearing loss increase your risk of dementia? And I think you can think through that Venn diagram and envision ways it might happen. So people who aren't hearing may become socially disengaged and more isolated and use their brain less in a way that causes a loss of cognitive reserve. Perhaps the absence of neurostimulation from the ear changes the networks in the brain itself. We know that depression is associated with dementia and cognitive loss. Perhaps there's an intermediary of depression in there. We also know that perhaps there are two symptoms, hearing loss and cognitive decline, from a unified underlying pathology, like perhaps these are from microvascular changes that cause both cognitive loss and hearing loss. And the experiment has really not been done to clearly demonstrate that if using hearing aids would actually change the risk. So I think hearing loss has been found to be a meaningful risk factor, and the time I'm spending on discussing this with you is to help you truly understand the quality of the evidence that we have, and recognize that for the most part these are epidemiologic studies in which issues of causation remain somewhat confusing. All right. So now I want to get into the meat of the matter. And the meat of the matter here, and my underlying thesis, is that we should be incorporating prevention strategies into our care of people across the lifespan, right, to promote a healthy aging experience that will minimize the risk of cognitive decline and dementia. And this is where it really gets interesting. There are 9 modifiable risk factors that account for over a third of the risk of dementia. Over a third of the risk of dementia can be attributed to modifiable risks. Again, I want to clarify, causation versus association remains a little confusing, but look at this list and tell me one that you would say, well, why would we bother to address that? And there are literally compelling reasons to build strategies around these risk factors, whether you're proposing them to help people avoid dementia or not. I think framing it as dementia prevention is both valid and productive. When you think back to the conversation we had just a little bit ago, where people over 55, the thing they're most worried about is cognitive loss. So I think that when you're helping people think through lifestyle change and their goals, and one of their goals would be, oh, I don't want to get dementia, there you go. Here is a change, a motivational change opportunity. So this particular table breaks these risk factors down in a way that is rooted in the research. So it's early life risk factor, midlife risk factor, late life risk factor. Now these come out of the research, not necessarily out of the life experience. So the research says that people who smoke late in life are at increased risk of dementia. The research says that people who have high blood pressure in midlife are at risk for dementia. It does not imply, and in fact I would argue that when you start to think about lifespan approaches, it doesn't mean that smoking in midlife isn't necessarily a risk factor. I would speculate, and it is a speculation, that people who smoke in midlife are higher risk of smoking in late life and therefore incur that risk of dementia. So again, helping, from my perspective as a primary care physician, one of the most salient experiences for me to help me understand what I was doing with my patients and to help my patients understand the advice I was giving them was all about, you're going to live a long time and you need to live your life in a way that ensures that you will be happy, healthy, and functional in your old age. And so these are the places to really focus effort if the intent is to create a strategy to help people avoid dementia. Now, it's broken down into early, midlife, late. And then over here in the two on my right, I don't know where it would be on yours. I think it'd be on your right. So you have the population attributable fraction, and then the weighted population attributable fraction. And if you look at that, that can get a little confusing. From my point of view, when you're talking about individual risk, you're talking about that far right-hand column called WPAF. And if you add that up, that adds up to the 35%. When you consider, and here's where it gets really interesting and really important to think globally. So if you're a person who cares about the health of whole populations of people, you want to know where do you get the most bang for your buck outside of the context of your encounters with each individual patient. And that second column from the right, called PAF, is the potential impact across populations of people. And you can see that from my perspective, there are several on here that really bang out at you, really strike out. And the big one for me is education. So the best evidence is that a primary education, just getting through K, not even K through 12, K through 9, primary education, reading, writing, arithmetic, is a major modifiable risk factor. And when you consider all the people in low income and middle income countries that don't have access to primary education, making a change there has a great potential to have a big impact globally on the global rates of dementia. Smoking also is a big one. And here, interestingly, once again, hearing loss ends up being very important from a population level and a global level, even though, as I said, we're not entirely sure yet that treating hearing loss would mitigate that risk. But just think about this. 9 risk factors account for 35% of the risk in individuals. So what I want to do here is I want to switch gears a little bit and talk to you about healthy aging. And there are a lot of different ways to think about healthy aging. In my day, when I was training in geriatrics, we spent a lot of time talking about successful aging. There were concerns with that particular model of envisioning the aging experience and being happy and fulfilled in old age. So we know at this particular time that health and experiencing health in your old age is a multi-dimensional concept, right? A person could have a heavy burden of disease and illness, but maintain meaningful social engagement and be perfectly happy and fulfilled. So there's this multi-dimensional character to healthy aging. So, but a nice way to think about it in that multi-dimensional construct comes from the National Prevention, Health Promotion, and Public Health Council. And they've spent some time trying to think through, okay, what do we mean and what are we trying to accomplish with a healthy aging framework? And so it's promoting health prevention, preventing injury, and managing chronic conditions, right? Optimal cognitive health, which is the domain we're talking about today, optimal physical health, optimal mental health, meaningful social engagement. I'm making the argument that achieving success, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, in these 5 domains is potentially a way to prevent dementia. And what we're just going to focus on here today is the healthy lifestyle behavior aspect. There are a lot of different ways that we as clinicians and healthcare providers and public health advocates and loved ones can promote a healthy aging experience. We're going to spend some time way at the very end, just talking about things across these domains. But for the most part, what I'm going to be talking today about are healthy lifestyle behaviors that are part of a strategy to promote a healthy aging experience and predictably minimize the risk for developing cognitive loss and dementia. I've highlighted what I believe are some of the shortcomings of the science around healthy aging for cognitive health. But I think that the best available evidence can support useful recommendation and guide lifestyle choices, especially when considered in light of the risk factors we've talked about and their known impact on other health conditions that affect the aging experience, can degrade quality of life, and through prevention can help people live perhaps a more physically functional experience. So I think I'm still comfortable that even though the science gives us some mixed messages, the best available evidence can support useful recommendations. And we're going to talk about those. And when I think about the healthy aging experience, I think it's useful to think across the lifespan. I've always been impressed. So I trained at Duke University, and the Center on Aging there started out as a center to study health across the lifespan. And it in my naive worldview, it seemed to evolve into something that focused on the end of that lifespan. So it became really a center focused on old age. But if you think across a lifespan, I think it's a useful way to think about health promotion, prevention, and avoiding the problems that many of us experience in our old age. And the risk factors that we've talked about here and how the science has categorized them, early life, midlife, late life, highlight the importance of this lifespan model. And I stole this picture from the Lancet. You can see the reference there. So this isn't like my idea. There are all kinds of people out there who are thinking the same thing. So intervening at childhood with meaningful primary education programs is of major importance for international prevention of dementia. Late midlife, that happens to be my particular cohort, represents a critical time period during which normal aging brains noticeably start to diverge from pathologically aging brains. It's an unstable period of life where we have risk factors that we know we can modify and potentially change that divergence. And then modifiable midlife and late life risk suggests there's an opportunity. So I continue to believe that it's not too late. I spent a substantial amount of time and energy in my practice as a geriatrician helping people to quit smoking because I felt it wasn't too late. It's not over till it's over. And I think that, again, these modifiable midlife and late life risks really suggest that there's opportunity even later in the lifespan. There are a couple of studies out there that have looked at, and I think I may have another slide talking about these, but what I really want you to see is the sentence there afterwards. and this is taken from a reference that was looking at these 3 trials, and based on the findings of these 3 pioneering studies, targeting interventions to people at increased risk of dementia might be effective. And again, I think when you think through what those risk factors are and their impact on other diseases, it makes sense for us to be highlighting them and actually building strategies, clinical strategies around helping people with them. So what would those be? So here are 7 modifiable risk factors. We talked earlier about 9, but you'll see that hearing loss is not on here, for instance. And here are 7 modifiable risk factors that increase the risk of dementia. Midlife hypertension. I don't know if I have a slide in here, but we in America are terrible at helping people with hypertension achieve their outcome goals. So huge opportunities just in improving our ability to identify and treat hypertension. Diabetes. We talked about over the next 10 years, we're expecting a 40% increase in type 2 diabetes. We know that this is in great deal related to our lifestyles of physical inactivity and overweight, completely modifiable. Low educational attainment. The best evidence we have is around primary education, but there are other studies, a little bit more mixed, that say that continued education continues to matter. Exercising our brains in a way that build cognitive reserve. Smoking, still the number 1 cause of premature death, I think, in the world now. So a modifiable risk factor that we can continue to screen for and target. Physical inactivity is epidemic in our culture. Midlife obesity is epidemic in our culture. And our ability to screen people, identify depression, and help people get it treated remains suboptimal. So just in these 7 modifiable risk factors that we are pretty confident increase the risk of dementia, you can identify or develop strategies to help people you know, to help yourself, and to help your patients. Now, I'm always, one of the things that I wanted to do was to give you a way to share this with patients and with other people, other audiences. And I happen to like the way the Alzheimer's Association frames this. So the Alzheimer's Association has a web page, and you can just Google Alzheimer's Association, 10 ways to love your brain, and you can get at that particular web page. So it's 10 things you can do to love your brain and lower your risk of dementia. And we're going to go through these kind of one by one. And I think it's a great thing to refer your patients to. When people ask you, you can say, hey, have you seen this thing on the Alzheimer's Association website? They actually have a beautiful little handout you could share with people. So, and I think it's a cute way to frame these particular pieces of advice, tips you can give to people. So break a sweat, hit the books, butt out, follow your heart, fuel up right, heads up, catch some Z's, take care of your mental health, buddy up, and stump yourself. So let's go through each of these 10 things to just put a little meat on each of the tips. So break a sweat, physical activity. Older adults who exercise are more likely to maintain their cognition than those who do not exercise. Exercise appears to be one of the most powerful protective measures, as it is across other chronic diseases. And I'd make the argument to people, if you don't like jogging, try Tai Chi. There's pretty good evidence that Tai Chi as a preferred physical activity not only improves balance and prevents falls, but actually can minimize cognitive loss. If you're thinking about why this might be, the bullet points there on the right highlight potential mechanisms by which physical activity could potentially be improving brain health. hit the books, go to school. I feel really good about this one, right? So I did my high school thing, did college, went to medical school, got a graduate degree, blah, blah, blah. So this particular part of a lifespan approach, I was fortunate enough to be able to do well. Now the key for me is to keep it up, right? In all honesty, primary education in early life has the best evidence. So really, the international strategy is make sure kids can just get that primary education. And it helps to mitigate the growing prevalence of dementia that they'll, as a population, experience. Why does it work? Nobody really knows. More education seems to build more brain power, speculating that there's a lot of, you have better cognitive reserve. And so the advice is keep your mind active. If you get a chance to and you have the time and the resources, think about formal study like at the community college or in my community, the recreation department often offers fun formal education classes. Don't smoke or quit smoking. Again, a common sense life. That's not fair. A well-documented healthy lifestyle behavior, not smoking. So we know that smoking is bad for vascularity. Smoking is bad for brain circulation as much as it's bad for heart circulation. Tobacco smoke also contains nerve toxins. And we know from our earlier slides that late life smoking is a risk factor for dementia. And I'd make the argument that it's never too late to help people quit smoking. And interestingly, having screened a lot of people for their tobacco use and oftentimes getting resistance when we start to talk about smoking cessation, the reality is that most older smokers want to quit. And my own personal anecdotes are filled with people who the first time we brought it up said, I'm not going to quit smoking. And then over the course of building a trusted relationship, changed their mind, and we were able to actually help them quit. So building in strategies to help people avoid tobacco, or if they're already a smoker, help them quit, is a meaningful strategy. Follow your heart. Prevent or treat high blood pressure. So here's the statistic. Only about half of the people in America with high blood pressure have it under control. Only half. Half of the people. So 14 million Americans with high blood pressure don't even know they have it right now. So building in inexpensive screening programs that can identify the people who don't even know they have high blood pressure and designing workflow in clinical settings around effective management of high blood pressure that actually achieves the recommended outcomes has potential value. And we're going to talk some about diet. Actually, I'll probably talk a lot about diet. And I think it's useful to remind ourselves that almost all of us eat too much salt. And if we want to be preserving our brains, we need to start thinking about ways that we can change the food intake to reduce the sodium. Manage heart disease risk. This is also part of the Follow Your Heart recommendation. So maintaining healthy cholesterol levels, avoid or minimize being overweight, and avoid or manage diabetes. And remember, we know now through the Diabetes Prevention Program interventions that lifestyle interventions, weight reduction, nutrition, physical activity, can prevent diabetes when done effectively. So there are legitimate strategies and interventions available to help us avoid diabetes, minimize being overweight, and help us keep our cholesterol levels under control. Fuel up right. Diet. diet ends up being very important, and when I consider my own personal midlife experience, it's been very clear to me that there's a lot of opportunity for me to improve. And interestingly, I have sort of taken it upon myself to try to better understand the details, like how do you actually do this? So not sort of the intellectual, yeah, Mediterranean diet is a good idea. Well, what do you buy at the grocery store and what do you prepare for your meals? And literally getting into almost the culinary medicine side of it. How do you actually prepare and find and create the food that we need to be able to fuel up right? And there are 3 diets that are worth understanding because they have relatively good evidence. One is the Mediterranean diet, which you can see here is characterized by low meat and dairy, a lot of fruit, vegetables, and fish, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and you get rid of butter and you switch to olive oil or canola oil. The DASH diet, which is really designed around treating hypertension, limits saturated and trans fats. The composition of the food is intended to increase the intake of potassium, magnesium, and calcium, and it's designed to boost fiber intake and protein. And what I'm going to spend the next few slides on is the MIND diet. And the MIND diet is a mashup of the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet, and incorporates some of the observations that have been made about particular foods that have been found to promote brain health. And there are 2 studies out there of the MIND diet and its impact on cognition. So you can actually go and read about the science behind the effectiveness of the MIND diet. Now, in terms of, is this a respected diet that you can hang your hat on? The U.S. News and World Report has this website out there on top diets, and this would be the number 5 diet. MIND diet would be number 5. Number 1 and 2, I can't remember in which order, are the Mediterranean diet and the DASH. So if you want to stick with either of those, that's terrific. But if you want to focus on cognition, the MIND diet is a mashup of the 2 and different in a subtle way. And so let's just talk about this. So this is the focus of the MIND diet. These are the foods that you focus on eating. You focus on including them in your daily meals. So berries end up being a big part of this. So rather than just saying fruit, okay, which I think all of us would agree would be part of a healthy diet, the evidence for berries in terms of promoting brain health is stronger. So the MIND diet focuses on berries, okay? Fish becomes an important part of it, so at least a serving of fish a day. I personally find that a little challenging, but have found ways for me to work fish into my weekly menu schedule and without an excess of salt, of sodium intake. Nuts become important. Beans or legumes, very much like the Mediterranean diet. Poultry becomes the protein source of choice, so turkey and chicken end up being very important. Green leafy vegetables, whole grains, and the incorporation of extra virgin olive oil. Again, similar to the Mediterranean diet, and reminding us that the MIND diet is this mashup of both the DASH diet and the Mediterranean diet. So again, 9 things to focus on, including, and then 5 things just to avoid. Now, the 2 in here that I've personally found most difficult are butter and whole fat cheese. So my family grew up in Vermont. You know, they were part of that Vermont dairy culture. My grandpa worked at the creamery. Man, do I love cheese. So it has been challenging. So, but again, when I think about the health effects, though, it starts to make sense to me. So try to minimize your intake of whole fat cheese. Try to minimize your intake of butter. Fried and fast foods, really for the most part, less than 1 serving a week. red meat rather than red meat, switch to poultry. And you're probably all familiar with the issues around alcohol. I actually put it in the part to limit, whereas some people categorize it as, drink your 2 servings of alcohol a day. I would make the argument that it's probably better to think about it in terms of limiting and keep it to less than an equal 2 servings of alcohol a day. I think the Mind Diet is a very manageable lifestyle change, and I think you may want to learn more about it for yourself and for giving your patients advice around it. And here are a bunch of websites you can go to. I've already talked about the U.S. News and discussion of the Mind Diet, and you can buy the book on Amazon. That's that particular link there. So this is just to help you, because I've often myself found conversations around culinary medicine and nutrition very high level and difficult for me to translate into what to do and what to tell a person to do and how to help a person with recipes and food choices. And this information here can get you to that granularity. All right, keep going here. So we spent a lot of time on fueling up, and let's now talk a little bit about brain injury. So wear your helmets when biking or doing contact sports. Don't fall. Fundamental concept in geriatrics. In fact, I told somebody just on Tuesday, a patient of mine, our goal for your life at this point is for you to stay upright and not fall. And everything we're going to do is about helping you stay upright and not fall. That remains an important construct. And then, of course, seatbelts when you're in the car. Catch some Z's. This one's a little controversial. The association versus causation issue, I think, is not entirely clear, but we do know that people who aren't sleeping well don't think well, and so let's just go with that and say, recognize that sleep deprivation affects memory and thinking, and sleep apnea continues to be an underdiagnosed problem that we need to identify. So catching some sleep and helping people manage their sleep and making sure they don't have a sleep disorder becomes very important. Manage depression. Again, there's some controversy about whether it's the chicken or the egg. Is depression an early symptom of evolving dementia, or is it a risk factor for dementia? It's a modestly controversial topic, but let's face it, it's still a good idea to have depression identified, diagnosed, and managed. And I continue to work into the workflow of my small practice efforts to screen for depression, identify it, and help people manage it. And it's part of a global lifespan strategy to help people maintain their cognition. Buddy up. This is a really important concept. So engage with friends and community. Staying socially engaged is really important for brain health. And we've even gotten to the point where I think the medical community ought to be out there advocating for neighborhoods and communities that foster engagement, movement, and socialization. So helping your patients pursue social activities. I've even had one colleague who's gotten to the point where she writes prescriptions for social activities, just to highlight how important she feels that is for her patients that are feeling more isolated. So very concrete action that their patient could take as a first step to broaden their engagement with others and be more social. Social isolation carries risk for conditions that would increase the risk of dementia. If you're going, well, why should that affect brain health? So ischemic vascular disease, hypertension, depression, and there are some neuroscientists who speculate that social isolation could result in cognitive inactivity, right? You're not interacting, you're not engaging, you're not laughing, you're not arguing, you're not stimulating the brain in a way that would help it be more robust. And so some people think that cognitive inactivity is potentially related to the increased risk of cognitive loss and dementia. And then the last one I have here would be stump yourself. So exercising the brain. Now, the first thing I'll say is I'll put forth the caveat that this isn't about necessarily going out and buying one of those products online that gives you brain stimulating games. There's nothing wrong with that, but they're not necessarily proven any more than doing Sudoku, is that the right word, Sudoku, in your newspaper, or crossword puzzles, or playing Mahjong with your friends, or a particular friend of mine plays Scrabble with her grandson every night. So brain power can be built into even your late life. And it seems that people who engage in brain stimulating activities are at lower risk. You don't necessarily need the commercial brain training tools. Play games that require some strategy. What was the game I was watching on TV the other day? Go. I've never played Go, but there was this documentary about the game Go, and I thought, wow, there's a strategy game I probably should learn to play. Take up handicraft, artistic stuff, painting, music, gardening. I love, this is my own phrase, enjoy the world around you. Read a good book, go to the movies, go to the concerts, theater, nature. It needs to be something that's not passive. So we find that, watching television is distinctly different from going out to the theater, going to a movie, sort of engaging in a bigger, more stimulating activity. So they should be activities that you would perceive require some effort, right? Some effort, some engagement, and some positive experience out of it that stimulates the brain. All right, so then you say, well, okay, that's cool. You have all this epidemiology data. And this is the slide I talked about earlier, where these are the big three multi-intervention trials that have been looked at. And quite frankly, if you go and read them, you will not be impressed that they demonstrate a powerful effect. But what they are showing, I think, is very tantalizing nuggets of change that, again, present a rationale to promote a series of lifestyle choices, lifestyle changes that I think you can confidently help your patients achieve. So for those of you who want to spend some time deeper into the clinical research, experimental clinical research around these 10 steps that are being promoted by me and the Alzheimer's Association, you can find these studies and really spend some time digging into it, which I highly recommend because I think they're actually very interesting. And like I said, they are tantalizing enough to have convinced me that these are things that are reasonable for me to take on in my own life and for me to be helping patients take on in their life. And then the last thing I just want to touch on before we really come to a close is two important areas. So one is the whole thing of what can you be doing to help patients take a lifespan approach to healthy aging, above and beyond cognitive issues. And then we're going to talk a little bit about engagement and helping patients with behavior change. Not a lot, it's not intended to be a presentation on either of those topics, but I think it's just useful to come to some closure around these areas. So 10 things that can be done to help people or help ourselves live a healthy experience across the lifespan, even into old age. And these include some of the elements we've talked about, which I'm starring here, that are good for brain health, but also include regular immunizations, cancer screening, changes that help people with bones, joints, muscles, preventing osteoporosis, for instance. So, and that there is more to it than healthy lifestyle behaviors. There are a lot of things that we do over the course of our clinical lives that help to promote a lifespan approach to healthy aging. And out of this list of 10, which is a common sort of popular 10 things to do to be healthy in your old age, the ones that are starred there are good for brain health. And then there's always the time management problem, and always the, geez, I don't get paid to help people with this stuff problem. Or, you've talked a lot about associations, and there's some uncertainty around causation, and quite frankly, it's hard to help people change. And I want to just give the cheerleader message here, which is that we actually can help our patients change. And I've talked at least about my personal experience with my patients who smoke, and I think that there are similar kinds of life changes that our patients have the potential to make, that some engagement with them as physician or nurse practitioner or physician assistant, healthcare provider, authority figures can help them with. So we can engage our patients and set them up for success by helping them understand what the changes are that can be made. We know that primary care providers can master motivational techniques and can be used in very time-limited encounters to help patients start to think through their overall goals and the healthy behavior changes that they can make to actually achieve those goals. Health systems can help people support their clients in healthy lifestyle change. So we may be one provider seeing one patient in the context of a big system, but imagine if that big system redesigned itself in a way that not only helped you treat the diseases with which they presented, but also helped them with healthy lifestyle and lifespan approaches to staying healthy and preventing an unhealthy experience in old age. And then I think there's this whole issue of what we're trying to accomplish, at least many are trying to accomplish in the U.S. around, what are we actually paying for with our healthcare dollars? And I think that what you are going to see, it's my hope actually that we see this, is that the movement to value-based payments will help our systems realign our workflows and realign the patient experience with health promotion, health prevention strategies that can actually help our patients have a healthy aging experience. So in summary, my thesis is essentially that there are a number of modifiable risk factors for age-related cognitive loss and dementia that have been identified, and although the science is not perfect, we know that many of those modified lifestyle behaviors are fundamental treatment approaches and prevention approaches to other chronic diseases, and it would make sense for us to be promoting a strategy that mitigates or minimizes the unhealthy risk factors in a way that can promote healthy aging and cognitive health. And if you just need a simple way to be able to communicate that to others and to either your patients or colleagues or friends, the Alzheimer's Association has this 10 Ways to Love Your Brain, which I think offers a very accessible framework in which that you can use to share and promote brain healthy lifestyle tips. Thank you for participating in our webinar. Appreciate your attention and the time you've put into hearing me. Good luck with your work, and continue to think through ways that you can promote a lifespan approach to healthy aging.